Thank you, Chair, and members of the Commission, public. That's correct. On July 12th, we had the initial public hearing for the project known as the Thomas. That's the name of the prospective project that's just across the street behind us here at the Pistago Epicentra property. For those of you that don't know, the owner of the property, the church, is looking to sell the property, and the prospective developer is looking to change the zoning on the majority of the property to allow some limited commercial uses. And I'll go through another PowerPoint, but I'll try to go a little bit more quickly over what some of you have already seen. So let me go ahead and share my screen with you so we can all follow along together. All right, so here we are at the August 9th, 2022 public hearing. It's a continuation of the hearing that started on July 12th. And for those of you that weren't able to attend the first one, I'll just kind of go through the meeting progress to date on the application. Some of you, maybe many of you, attended the May 17th neighborhood meeting. That was presented by the applicant. And the applicant's representative is here tonight to further present when the item comes up for discussion on his behalf. We had a study session on June 14th. At that time, staff presented the project to the commission that's here just as for informational purposes only. It was a hearing discussion. And then, of course, on July 12th, we had the first public hearing that was over at Sowers Hall. And I want to thank everybody for your flexibility in joining us here tonight. Unfortunately, Sowers Hall was not available for the same night, so we had to scramble a bit and thank you to St. Peter's for allowing us to be here tonight. So we're here tonight for a continuation of the July 12th public hearing. Just as a review, for those that may not have the property details, the Pistago Epicentro Phoenix property is directly east of us, which is behind my back. And that is a 3.6 acre property. It includes the Assembly Chapel Hall, about 10,000 square feet of offices and daycare, and then a small rectory building. It's bound by the Tierra Verde Lake Park and townhomes on the north, single-family homes to the east, Indian School in the city of Goodyear to the south, and then ourselves here and the maintenance facility for the city on the other side of, on the west side of Litchfield Road. The request specifically is a change in land use on our general plan from public facility to commercial on the property, with the exception of the Church Assembly Hall. The Church Assembly Hall would remain public facility as proposed by the applicant. Further, the applicant seeking to rezone a portion of the property that would exist of the other buildings, not the church or assembly hall, but the smaller buildings, the 10,000 square foot office and the rectory building. The intention there would be to allow limited professional offices and some limited commercial uses. Basically what they want to do is keep the church's daycare, allow professional offices in the building to the east of the church, and allow the rectory building to perhaps convert into some sort of a cafe restaurant. That's the vision that the applicant has presented as part of what they call an adaptive reuse of the facility. I just kind of gave you the recap of that in the slide here. I've gone into more detail of what adaptive reuse is, and we went into this detail last month. But again, they're wanting to repurpose the property to expand the uses allowed on site. None of the buildings are proposed to be changed except perhaps their exteriors and interiors remodeled. So they're not adding any additional floors to it. They won't remove any of the existing buildings. They would just, they would fill in kind of the spaces between the buildings with new landscaping and outdoor seating, presumably for people that would be at the cafe where they could sit outside and dine and read a book, or people using the offices. They would have a place to recreate outside amongst the cafe environment. The same would go for the church congregation. When the church congregation services are over, they could filter out of the assembly hall and recreate in the center. The site plan is illustrative in color up here on the board. I know for those of you in the back, it looks quite small on the screen up there. This is a colorized version of what's existing, with the exception of the proposal to add about 4,000 square feet of possible additional office space on the site. That would go to on the south side of the existing larger building. So if you look up on the screen, you're not going to really be able to see my mouse moving, I don't believe. I guess you can, kind of. It's this building over here in the northeast corner. Oh, thank you. Someone's got a better mouse than I do. That is that building there is existing, of course. It's the one you can see if you just look outside. But the proposed future phase would be located just south of it or under it on the site plan. up against the existing parking lot. All of the buildings would remain single-story, and the project would seek to reuse the existing buildings, again, for professional office and limited retail and cafe uses. Their architect has done some conceptual renderings of how they would refresh the exterior of the project to make it somewhat more inviting for that kind of cafe, retail, office experience, as well as enhance the experience for the congregation that would be staying on site. So we talked about this last month. When this was initially presented, the idea was that the church would no longer stay on site. Our understanding is that the applicant would be entering into a 5-year leaseback agreement. So if the church could sell the site, they could afford to stay on site through a leaseback agreement for 5 years. Now, we know that that's a private agreement between the congregation and the property owner, and it's not something that would be guaranteed for 5 years, but that's the intent that was presented to us by the applicant. So the existing Vistago congregation is intended to stay on site in the assembly and chapel hall, and they'd also continue. This came up at the last meeting. I think I saw the gentleman here mention what would happen with the daycare, how would we have supporting services for the church. I didn't know at the time, but my understanding is that lease agreement would include the space for the daycare for the children while their services are held there. Again, some additional follow-up. We talked about this already. The church would lease back, and the pastor of the church, Roberto Romero, he's a senior pastor. He had sent in a letter just before the hearing asking for the neighborhood to support them in their endeavor to sell the church to the applicant, Mr. O'Connor, through Tri-West Realty, so that they could lease the property back and stay on site with their intent to stay for 5 years. I wanted to revisit some of the questions that came up last month, and that was some members, not all, many of the neighbors already know this, but the property is not actually zoned residential. It's not also zoned just for a church. The church, of course, isn't allowed use. The property is zoned public facility. So I wanted to recap some of the development standards that are allowed in public facility, just as for you to keep in the back of your mind. So in the event that perhaps this project was not successful, or if it did not get approved, and somebody else were to consider purchasing the property, if it was a church, they maybe would just reuse the existing facility. If it wasn't a church and they wanted to do something different, the property does have some development rights that they could utilize. So as a recap, public facility has certain development rights that they can do without a rezoning. They can build up to 3 stories or 45 feet in height. Their setbacks along both street frontages, or actually all 3 street frontages, would be 20 feet. And then for the residences that are on the east, they would be required to set their buildings back at least 30 feet. And lot coverage, which means the amount of the lot you're allowed to cover, could be up to 60%. Some of the uses that are currently allowed in the public facility that would not require rezoning, many of them would still require what's called a use permit, so it's a discretionary review by this commission, council, and would involve the public. Those include arcades, games and centers, cemeteries, child care centers, churches, of course, there's already a church there, health and medical clinics, commercial recreation, community facilities, continuum of care facilities if you have at least 20 acres. In this case, that site's not 20 acres. Convention services, convalescent homes. It's kind of an older term. We would call that more so a skilled nursing facility, or maybe even a nursing home. That would require a use permit. Farmers markets are allowed. Fraternal and civic clubs, like a VFW or something like that, could go there. Government facilities, of course, are allowed in public facility. Health clubs or gyms could go there. An information center. And you could actually propose offices, professional or business, with a use permit, plant nurseries, greenhouses, schools, solid waste stations, stables, and veterinary services like a vet clinic or a hospital. Those are all allowed, but they would require a use permit. We were asked to prepare a map that kind of outlined the public's interest in regards to opposition and support. We had a little bit of help on the map, and we did pin everybody in opposition and everybody in support. You can see quite a lot of red pins on there for the opposition. There's approximately around 190 showing against it, 28 for it, a total of 218 residents. You can see the clustering of the pins. Many of those are from the two or three petitions that we received. So where you see a lot of the clustering was from the people that took the time to go door to door to engage with their neighbors and get signatures in opposition to the commercial rezoning. The pros, generally speaking, from those that were in support, is that they wanted to support small business, they wanted more local dining options, they encouraged or wanted adaptive reuse in their neighborhoods, opportunity for tax revenue, and that we didn't have enough places for local arts and for civic events. For example, the church assembly hall could be used for live production of plays or things like that, holiday sort of events. The cons are increased traffic, commercial activities in an area that's predominantly residential, and the concern of losing a church. When we have just only 4 churches in the city, there's a concern that we would lose one of the churches with the commercial development. What's proposed here by the applicant is they're willing to limit all of the buildings on site to 1 story rather than 2 or 3 stories. They would stay 1 story, and that would be protected by the planned development overlay. Their interest is in protecting the church congregation and daycare as part of the religious facilities. They'd like to limit their uses to professional offices, retail on a small scale. There's not really that much square footage over there. And then, of course, the restaurant cafe, which has been proposed since it's been presented in the rectory building. They're looking to restrict uses that are currently allowed in commercial. They're asking to restrict a list of uses, including, since the last time we spoke, they are actually going to include a restriction to restrict bars, taverns, and cocktail lounges. Wanted to pay special attention to the chair and the commission. There was some confusion as to what the role of what's called a planned development was in this case. The planned development tool means even though they're asking for commercial, when they ask for a planned development, it becomes kind of a customized zoning district where you can restrict uses and impose you can impose standards on the project to make it otherwise, if it would not otherwise be, the neighborhood would not otherwise accept it, that perhaps they could impose additional standards to the extent that it would make it something compatible with the neighborhood. So the applicant would be tied to the site plan and the exhibits provided. They would be subject to all of the use restrictions that we've listed. They would be subject to any prospective other restrictions that P&Z, this commission might state, or that the council might state in September on the 21st when they see this, or if any of the neighbors were to bring up any additional restrictions. These restrictions could include, but aren't limited to, limiting commercial uses from specific portions of the site, consideration of limitations on hours of operation on perhaps some of those commercial uses, perhaps considering a limitation on what's proposed to be the future phase of the project. If there's a concern with the future phase, that could be also limited. Those are all the sorts of things that I think the Commission and public should consider when evaluating the case. Again, as a reminder, the Commission tonight would be making a recommendation on this item, whether it's for the denial or for approval with conditions to the City Council. They would be hearing this item, likely to be hearing this item on September 21st. The public meetings are scheduled out as follows. We had been considering introduction of this item until recently to the council on July 20th, but we decided not to do that, but this is what we presented to you last month. And we do anticipate that this item will go forward on the September 21st council agenda. So that said, I'd happy to answer questions, and then I can toggle to different exhibits within the project if the public or the applicant needs me to.
Any questions among the commissioners? Okay.
In your summary, it seemed to contemplate possibly a limitation on the hours of operation. Can you comment on that?
In the respect of some of the concerns we heard from the neighbors with, from noise late night, for if there were restaurants or bars, Obviously, bars have now been stricken as a permitted use, so if perhaps a restaurant or other type of retail use were to be allowed, it is within the commission and the council's purview. If they wanted to set hours of operation restrictions in the plan development, they could do so. I think there was a concern, especially if anybody were to support it, that there would be late night activity that would disturb the neighbors.